Hello everybody, this is Darksiders Genesis. Darksiders as a series kind of has a special place in my heart just because it's fairly unique. It does things that not a lot of games do, being sort of like a combination between like a 3D Zelda and a God of War, basically style of game that has its own pretty unique personality and some pretty interesting characters and stories, and especially Darksiders 2, that one kind of has the most special place for me. I've actually never played the third one, but I really should do that at some point. But anyway, Darksiders is a pretty cool series. You play as the horseman of the apocalypse, of course differing a bit from the biblical ones because pestilence and famine are not present, I suppose, because it would kind of be somewhat difficult to create abilities based on those things, and they are instead replaced with fury and strife. But it is a pretty neat series. And this time they have released something that's a little bit different. It is actually a prequel to the first game, to sort of, in the first game where the events sort of start to unfold and everything really goes wrong, this is a prequel to all of that. That sort of shows you the foundation to what actually happens and why, which is pretty neat because, of course, this is not Darksiders 4. It is not continuing on from 2 and 3. This is very much a before everything happened sort of thing. And you'll, of course, also very obviously notice that it is not the traditional third-person sort of action RPG sort of thing, and it is in fact an isometric viewpoint. However, despite the way that it looks, this is not a Diablo style of game. This is not, Path of Exile, Grim Dawn, etc., etc. This is not that, where you click to move and you have hotkeys and everything. It doesn't play like that at all. Interestingly enough, it plays like Darksiders, which I guess isn't that much of a surprise because it is Darksiders, but when you look at it, you don't really think that it's going to be the same style of game, but it actually is. And the first couple of clues to this actually being the case is, one, it recommends a controller, which honestly it works just fine with the keyboard and mouse as well, but you wouldn't normally play like an isometric ARPG with a controller. And two, it has a jump button, which is probably your first big clue that it is not a Diablo clone, because of course you don't jump in those games. And it plays just exactly like Darksiders pretty much, and honestly it's kind of impressive to me how much has changed for this particular entry while also remaining the same, and I do mean that in a positive way, because a lot of it, the viewpoint and some other mechanics have changed to be a little bit different and to be a sort of a different entry in the series. However, the heart of Darksiders, what really makes it, Darksiders, is still here, and it still plays in a completely recognizable way. Which is sort of fascinating that they've actually managed to do that, to both change the base gameplay while keeping the actual gameplay loop and everything that you would recognize if you've played the previous games intact. So, in this game, as I mentioned, it is a prequel, and you do play as Strife, the fourth of the horsemen that has yet to be revealed until this point, who is a sort of, he's really fun to play actually. He is very much like your gunner type of character, very fast, very agile, lots of very fast-hitting melee attacks, quite acrobatic, and of course a lot of ranged attacks because he has dual guns. You get one of them in Darksiders 2 actually, and you have many ammo types to choose from and a couple of different ways to use them, and of course you have the sort of tricky extra abilities, things like creating images of yourself that can taunt enemies and fire for you, and caltrops that explode and draw in enemies to them and stuff like that. So he is kind of like your agile, ranged character, but he does have some pretty nice, quick melee abilities as well. And you also can play as War in this game, because this is a co-op game, although you don't have to play it in co-op, but it does support that. It supports both split screen and online co-op, which is pretty awesome, and I believe it also supports remote play together, which is fantastic. But if you are playing solo, you can just switch between them. You can play as War and Strife on every mission, and you just click a small button combination and off you go. You just switch characters, and each character has their own pieces of gear that can interact with different parts of the environment in different ways. They have their own special abilities, their own combos, their own upgrades, and everything like that. So you'll be wanting to switch between them quite often because you'll actually have to. Each one is better at handling different situations, not only in fighting, but also in actually solving the environmental puzzles, because this is Darksiders, so it does have, your Zelda-esque puzzles in the environment. Another thing that is maybe surprising in its inclusion, if you didn't really know that this was not like a Diablo-style game, there are Darksiders-esque platforming and puzzles. So you'll be platforming around the place, doing lots of jumping, lots of climbing, going across, shimming across ledges and jumping on your various acrobatic wind currents and stuff like that, all the stuff that you would really expect from a normal third-person Darksiders game, but you'll be doing it from this more isometric style of camera angle, which has its own problems, I will admit, because the camera angle can sometimes make judging jump distances and depth a little difficult. It's not as easy and intuitive as when you have full control of a third-person camera. if you have like a camera like this, sometimes if you're trying to move to the right and there's a platform to the right that you need to jump to, sometimes it's difficult to actually see how right it is. You know, is it slightly in the foreground? Is it slightly in the background? Do you need to sort of angle yourself? Sometimes it can be a little bit tricky to do the platforming. Luckily, there's not like a tremendous amount of platforming, but it's there in the same way that it was in the previous games. And there's also a couple of other interesting mechanics. So, as you would probably guess, each character has their own mechanics, their own ways of fighting, and Strife has something called Hot Streak, which is pretty cool. Basically, as he does damage, as he executes enemies and all that sort of stuff, he will build up this Hot Streak meter, and when it actually fills up, he will go into Hot Streak, which will cause his all of his ranged attacks to change a little bit. The different ammo types have a sort of special use that they will trigger when in Hot Streak, and you will also have infinite ammo of all of them, which is extremely useful. Every ammo type besides your basic ammo does have, as you can see at the bottom of the screen there, an actual ammo pool. You can equip 2 different ammo types at once, and if you absolutely have to, you can fall back on the basic infinite ammo shots, but all the others are of course much more powerful in various different ways. And as an example, for instance, you could get something like the static shot, which I really like, which is basically a chain lightning shot. As you fire it, it arcs between various enemies and does damage to all of them as long as they're in a close enough group. When you're on Hot Streak, the static shot turns into this big white lightning bolt that arcs much farther and does way more damage and is super strong, but it also drains your Hot Streak meter very quickly, so you have to make sure your shots count. You also have stuff like the lava shot, which is pretty cool. That's the one on the right side of the meter there at the bottom of the screen right now. And it acts like kind of like a minigun tends to act. It has like a spool up time, you know, when you first start firing it, it fires slowly, but as you keep the button held down, it fires faster and faster. And the shots are really strong because they do like a small initial hit of damage when they contact enemies, but then they stick to them and do damage over time for a while, and then one final burst of damage because they explode afterwards. And of course, since you can like volley these things in huge numbers very quickly, if you hold the button down for long enough, you can do a lot of damage very quickly, and it's very good against larger enemies and bosses. And during Hot Streak, it actually changes completely into a sort of medium-range flamethrower that just pierces through all enemies and is really, really strong. You've also got some really cool kind of exotic ones that are best used in combination with other things, like the gravity shot, which basically fires forward black holes, and they draw in enemies, of course, and they do slight damage over time as the enemies are caught in them, and you can charge the shot between 3 different charge levels, the final of which will have much increased sort of suction power and a little bit more damage over time. And during Hot Streak, it causes the shots to automatically be fully charged without the need to actually charge them. And they do a lot more damage over time, and they also explode when they expire instead of just collapsing, which is pretty sweet. And of course, that's really that's used that's used best when in combination with stuff like the static shot, because you're going to draw enemies together into a small group so that you can hit them all with other stuff like that. Pretty cool, honestly. War, of course, has his trademark Chaos Eater, the gigantic sword, and various enhancements that you can equip with it. Usually these are like charged attacks and elemental attacks that you can gather as you go throughout your adventure. Things like being able to fire lightning out of it, to causing enemies to explode on death, to just being like a big fiery vortex that can move all around the arena while slashing everything around you. It's pretty cool, and he is, of course, very much more based around melee attacks and lots of melee combos in the traditional Darksiders sense. I mean, he plays a lot like his Darksiders 1 self, which is pretty cool. So they're obviously very different characters, and of course they also have a very different gear that they can get, because as is the case in Darksiders, you will also have to solve various environmental puzzles and things, and each character has 3 different pieces of gear that they can actually attain and use in different ways, from like that one that you just saw there, the Tremor Gauntlet, which lets you destroy these red crystals and also hit these switches on the floor they normally couldn't, to the portal thingamajiggers that Strife gets. They throw these little bombs that create portals around the place on special areas like that purple sigil there on the wall and allow you to do various portal shenanigans. So that's another thing about the game that is surprisingly intact, the kind of thing that you wouldn't necessarily expect from an isometric perspective like this. The sort of Metroidvania Zelda-esque aspects of going back and, you know, going to places that you've been before, but now that you have some sort of skill that allows you to get up to a higher platform, or some sort of item that allows you to interact with something that you couldn't before, go back and get stuff that you missed previously. And this game actually does indeed have that. Now, the previous Darksiders games were all in like a contiguous open world, or at least in very large open areas with small loading screens between each one. It was mostly like an open world kind of experience, again, very Zelda-esque, very much like a 3D Zelda. And this actually opts for a stage-based progression instead, where the areas are actually contained in their own stages, and you go back to like a hub area to upgrade and spend money and stuff in between. and the stages themselves are sort of self-contained adventures, and each one is often quite large and open with lots of places for you to go. The game can be very arbitrary as to when you can actually use your horse. Sometimes it's a little bit weird. Some areas are beyond these sigils that allow you to not use your horse, but only in specific directions around the sigils, which is weird, and some areas just don't let you use it at all, even though they're big, wide, open outdoor areas like other areas. You just can't use your horse. It's very selective sometimes as to when the actual horsemen of the apocalypse can ride their horse, but still, it's only noticeable because you will be doing some backtracking and things, of course, to go back to previous bits of terrain and stuff that you couldn't get to beforehand, because you'll get new gear later that allows you to go back to them. So you can go back and play each individual stage whenever you want, and each stage also has 4 difficulties that allow you to get better gear. There's also the creature core system that creatures can drop their cores, which are like these passive abilities that you can slot on this skill tree-like thing that is the creature core tree, and each one will have their own little stats that they give your characters, as well as larger passive abilities, and you can match them to different types of nodes on this big tree to create sort of a build. It's pretty cool, actually, and a lot of the rarer creatures, like big bosses and things, are pretty powerful and add some interesting stuff to the combat and the exploration by changing your character's skills around a bit. It's pretty neat, especially the ones that add new things to your skills. Like, for instance, I mentioned those caltrops that explode. One of my favorite cores is one that makes it to where those caltrops will actually draw in enemies, so it kind of changes the situations in which you would want to use that skill. But yeah, the areas are very large and open, and there are tons of collectibles scattered around them, from like souls to buy stuff to boatman coins, which you also need to buy stuff, especially like bigger new creature cores and upgrades for your character's combos and things. And also other bits like extra health, extra wrath, which is what you use for most of your special abilities, and other things like these armor pieces, which are kind of mysterious to me, and they're a little bit Mega Man X, it seems like, because they're like very powerful but very hard to find armor pieces that once you collect them all will unlock some sort of special ultimate for each character, which is pretty cool. And so yeah, it definitely has like the classic Darksiders feel of like that sort of Zelda-esque backtracking Metroidvania sort of thing. It's just in a stage-based format this time and an isometric viewpoint. So it's really interesting how much of the traditional Darksiders gameplay is intact despite the large change in gameplay style. It's actually not as much of a change as it looks like, and I actually don't mind that, because I think it's cool how they've managed to change the formula a little bit while still keeping it recognizably Darksiders. Honestly, it's just a really fun romp through the Darksiders world, and it's cool how you get to switch between characters. It's cool that you can actually play co-op if you want. There's enough variety and interesting stuff here to keep you entertained, I feel. It's a cheaper game than your traditional Darksiders. It is $30 at full price instead of your usual $60 as they are on release. And that doesn't really reflect like a significant lack of content, like it's a much shorter game. It's really not. There's quite a lot to see and do here. It's just a very different game, and I appreciate a company sort of taking a different approach. Instead of making each entry of their game the same but the sequel, they've actually, changed it a little bit. It's almost a spin-off, but it's still directly connected to the universe and still uses the same sort of gameplay, just in a bit of a different style. It's unique, you don't see this sort of thing very often. You don't see game developers actually creating an entry of their universe that is very different and yet also the same and recognizable in many ways. It's something that I often really enjoy Final Fantasy because of, Final Fantasy has all kinds of spin-offs of various different kinds, but they're all recognizably Final Fantasy. They're just very different in gameplay in different ways, and this is kind of that sort of same school of thought, this same school of development that is creating a new entry that is a spin-off but is still a worthwhile to the main entry's kind of plot and gameplay. It's really neat, and honestly, for $30, especially with this co-op gameplay and everything, it is definitely worth picking up. The combat is still very, very satisfying, despite being from an isometric viewpoint. It still feels just as satisfying as the traditional third-person hack and slash that Darksiders is kind of known for, and has a kind of interesting story, honestly. If you enjoy the story of Darksiders and you want to see a little bit more of the foundation, kind of how it all started and what kicked off a lot of the crazy events that the first game starts off with, then this will actually tell you. And of course you get to see Strife in action, which is cool, because he's a lot of fun to play. So that has been Darksiders Genesis. I would recommend it because it's a really cool experience for those who like Darksiders. It's neat how they've managed to keep everything intact while also making it a bit fresh. And for only $30, it's a really nice value prospect, honestly, because it's fairly long. I've put about 8 hours into it so far, 7.5, 8 hours, and I'm like halfway there. So it's a pretty fun time. I would absolutely recommend it. The link will be, as always, in the description below this video. Thank you guys very, very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.